This is better than yoga. The yoga picture was such a terrorist move.
You look like you were like,
Great.
when we get to the Q&A, can you walk around with a microphone?
Maybe.
You think
Yes, I can.
we are live?
I can't find my clicker, but I have it. I'll find it in between. I'll find it like during what you're saying. Is that cool? Oh, because you need it for what you're saying. Well then, distract people for 1 moment. You wouldn't mind. Do you have Bluetooth?
What is this?
Skip speeds. They can see what we're doing, right?
Yep.
This is a nice computer.
Thank you.
data launch event. We've been trying to figure out exactly what we want to call this event because there's so much fun stuff that will be going on today. What we've decided is to call it the Global Human Rights Project release of the GRIP grades, okay? So welcome to the second annual event of this kind. First of all, thank you very, very much for coming. It's cold outside, so thanks for making it out today in the cold. So my name is Meg Frost. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies here at URI and an Assistant Professor of Political Science, started this semester. So in terms of what we're going to do today, so you can all see from the agenda, we have a great slate of presentations that are on deck and coming at you. For the first hour and a half, we will be hearing from Dr. Skip Mark, who is the director of the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies and the co-director of the C-Rights Data Project, and Dr. David Cingranelli, who is a founding member, the founder, actually, of the C-Rights Data Project and a current co-director, also a professor of political science at Binghamton University and the director of their Human Rights Institute. Special thanks first go to all of the URI students who are here today, who at 4 o'clock will be giving spotlight on rights presentations, and then at 5 o'clock we'll be doing a poster session where they show off all of the incredible work that they've been doing for the entire semester. So my job here, just to give you an introduction to the event, is to go through exactly what we're going to be doing, and then now to express our heartfelt thanks to several people who are sitting in the room and who are not sitting in the room yet, but you'll see later today. So first, Tom Sylvia, sitting here in the blue sweatshirt, and Shannon Chanley deserve our heartfelt thank you for all of their support and resource funding. This report and the data it highlights, I cannot stress strongly enough how we could not have done this without their support over the years, without their generous support. Also, thank you to Skip Mark, who created a lot of the report that you see today. I hope you all have a report. Does everyone have one? Make sure you pick up one of the reports. Kate Sylvester is the other main contributor to this report, so our heartfelt thanks go to Kate. We have a lot of research fellows in the room who worked on several aspects of this data, or of these data, and of this data set, and made it so that we could launch this today. Those fellows include Kate Sylvester, Yulia Akhumova, Amanda Quiroz, Aliyah Haider, Zara Khan, Maya McNeil, Mary Lind, Roberta Marquez, and Caitlin Muteru. Thank you very, very much for all of your help with that. So a lot of the students who are the research fellows this semester, and who are the research fellows over the summer as well, are from they're undergraduates and graduate students in political science. And most of the students that you'll be hearing from today are from the 300 level human rights class that Dr. Mark teaches, and the graduate level international relations class that Dr. Mark also happens to teach. This data project, we build off of, we stand on the shoulders of data giants, I guess you could nerdily say, including some of them who are here in this room. Dr. David Cingranelli back there at that table. We owe a lot of thanks to him for keeping this data project going since the 1980s. Mikhail Filipov is also a contributor to the data project from Binghamton University, and we have a lot of students who've been working on the data from Binghamton University over the years, and they continue to this day. So this partnership that we have couldn't actually be possible without the students at URI, but also the students at Binghamton University. So the political science at Binghamton University deserves a shout out. They have contributed a great deal to this project as well. So David Richards and his students at the University of Connecticut have also been involved in producing these data and in helping to identify some of the trends that we see in this report this year. So at URI, we have it's actually kind of hard to overstate and understate, actually, the amount of support that we have received from the College of Arts and Sciences and Dean Jeanette Riley, who feels very strongly about the human rights work that we've been doing and has been eminently helpful and generous with resources so that all of this could be possible. Associate Dean Brian Kruger of the College of Arts and Sciences has also been incredibly helpful, as has Kristen Johnson, the Provost for Global Initiatives. And sorry if I'm not including all of the things that are in all of your titles. You all do so much. So we are particularly grateful to the College of Arts and Sciences event fund that has helped us to put on an event of this size and caliber. So thank you very much for that. Professor Cheryl Foster, we need to mention, from the Political Science Department. She's been incredibly helpful in identifying students to work on these projects and helping them along. She's also as with all of these people, absolutely wonderful human beings who feel very strongly about human rights and bringing them forward. So finally, we are thankful to the Social Science Institute for Research, Education, and Policy at URI. They funded several of the undergraduate research assistants that we are collaborating with for these projects. So before introducing Dr. Mark, who I believe is going to go first, right? I'll just tell you that there are a couple different buckets of things that we do here at the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies. I need to remind myself to stay close to the microphone, even though I'm too loud for the microphone. A couple different things that we do at the Nonviolence and Peace Studies Center that we're very excited about are that we have 3 different buckets of things that we're working on. First, we have Tupten Tendhar, Dr. Tupten, back there, and he works on inner peace initiatives, right? So the other night we had a Tibetan music concert that was very well attended, and a lot of the inner peace stuff is kind of what's missing from issues of international conflict, violence, and human rights. The inner peace aspect is very, very important, and we're eminently grateful to Tupten for doing that work. The second bucket of things that we do at the center is we do nonviolence education trainings for activists. So we kind of have the inner peace arm of our center, and we have the activist arm of our center. Every summer here, actually in this room, we do a nonviolence training based on the principles of Dr. Martin Luther King's teaching and Gandhi's teaching, in basically how to start or to engage in nonviolent activism and civil resistance. So if anyone's interested in doing that training, it ends up being very rewarding every year to see how people use frameworks from different social movements to, in the 21st century and beyond. The third bucket of what we do at the center is essentially what we're all here to nerd out and to work on today, which is our data arm. The C-Rights data set is the largest human rights data set in the world. We're very proud to house the data set here at the University of Rhode Island, previously housed at Binghamton University. We code, and our scorers code, human rights violations that take place all across the world. We have data for all of the UN-recognized countries since 1980 across several political, social, and economic rights. So we're going to spend the afternoon learning about those and going over trends that we see that are trends that are things that are improving, things that should be improved upon, the things that we would like to improve upon in the future as a global community, and our data helps with that. So this event is part of we hope for this to be every year in December. We'll launch the data set, and you can see all of the updates that we've made over the past years. And essentially, we can start to bridge the gap. Our goal is to bridge the gap between the academic study of human rights activism, and kind of the inner peace arm of nonviolent civil activism, basically. So if anyone has any questions about that, please let us know throughout the day. You ready? All right, without further ado, Dr. Skip Mark. He is an assistant professor of political science here at the University of Rhode Island with a focus on international relations, dabbles in comparative politics a little bit, and the co-director of the Sea Rights data set, which is the data that we're talking about today. What else? It's enough. Very humble, Skip. Okay, so welcome, everyone. Oh, and I think one more thing that I should say is that planning this event, Deirdre, Tupton, and James, if we could have a round of applause for them. And Angelique, thank you very, very much for all you're doing. Couldn't have been possible without you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm going to give you some of the findings from the report and talk a little bit about the human rights data we collect, but I'm also going to give you a sense of some of the things we want to do in the future. So one of the things I really like about this report is it was created by faculty, students, and staff here at the University of Rhode Island. And this is really a URI-led initiative. This is the first global report card. We don't really have many examples of this, and if you go to Google and type in who has the best human rights, you might see who has the most freedom or is the most democratic or the best civil rights, but you're not really gonna find anything about who has the best overall human rights. And so our aim with this is to look at as many different human rights as possible, not just the ones that we see in the news, but as many of the ones that are recognized in international law as we can, because we find some really interesting things when we do. So I'm going to start with just basic definitions. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights defines human rights as rights we have simply because we exist as human beings. They are not granted by any state, right? So everyone has human rights. You cannot lose them, right? If you commit a crime, you cannot lose them if you're from a group that the majority don't particularly like. These are things that the international community has come together to say, you have these rights no matter what. And we say they're universal, indivisible, and interdependent. Universal means that they apply to everyone, everywhere. Indivisible means that all rights should be treated equally. There are no rights that are more important than others. And interdependent and interrelated means that we can't look at one right without understanding what is happening to others. We actually need to look at the full set of human rights to have an idea of what is going on. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came out of World War II, was a really radical document. Most countries in the world came together and said, here are all of the things that our citizens have a right to. Now, I think if you tried to do this today, it would fail, right? And so human rights are really unique in the sense that this whole regime comes out of the legacy of World War II and the atrocities committed during World War II, particularly by Germany in Israel, right? So the human rights regime is radical. It is saying governments have a duty to protect their citizens, and there are no excuses for violating rights. So we take the opinion that when citizens are informed of their rights, and they demand that leaders respect their rights, that's when we see human rights get better. So if you don't ask for rights from those in power, you will not get them, and you will actually see them deteriorate. And right now we are at sort of a crucial moment in history where we are seeing a lot of democratic backsliding, we're seeing a rise in inequality, we're seeing a rise in intolerance and hate. We still have massive conflicts raging across the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa and many countries that make this more important than ever. So we start with just a couple of questions, and I want you to think about this for your own country. Which rights are most and least protected in your country? Which human rights treaties has your government ratified? How do rights in your country compare to the rest of the world? And how do you know the answer to any of these questions? So I will tell you, before I became a human rights scholar, I wouldn't have been able to answer this. And honestly, before this project came together, I would have had a hard time answering the first and the third bullet. And that's because there isn't enough information, there isn't enough educational resources for the public, for students, for media, for policymakers to really get a sense of this. So we have some answers in academic research. I'm a scholar, but there are a lot of problems with this, right? Most of the stuff we publish as academics is behind a paywall, meaning you can't access it unless you are at a university. A lot of them charge $40 an article. There are open access journals, but some of them are predatory. And so the things that are published there are not as rigorous. They don't go through sort of peer review and the scientific process to ensure that they're telling us something true. A lot of the methods are unintelligible. As any of my students, I'll show some of the stuff we publish in political science. There are mathematical equations, and I can see people's eyes glaze over, right? And so this is not a good source. If you are not a specialist political scientist or human rights lawyer, this stuff is really not accessible. And so what we're left with is trust us as academics to know how the world works. And I'm always inherently skeptical of anyone telling me to trust them if I can't look at what is actually happening. And I think our job as citizens is to engage with research, to find facts and data and educate ourselves so that we can be informed and we can make demands of our governments. That is the hallmark of democracy. So we are really interested in human rights education, right? And the idea that if you know what your rights are and you can demand them, we're going to see human rights improve. And this ties in with a lot of the nonviolence work we do, because if your rights are respected, you have no need for violence. In political science, we study conflict, what causes people to protest, engage in terrorism and rebellion. And at the heart of it is always human rights violations. That is the starting point. And you end up in intractable conflicts. And what we've found over and over again is that when governments respect the rights of their citizens, we don't see civil war, we don't see terrorism. We see things improve and we see peace. So human rights is a path to peace. And when your rights are violated, nonviolence, activism is how you can improve them. So, this report is our attempt to try and educate the public, but also to hold governments accountable, right? Grades are important. We are asking countries to protect their citizens' rights. And this report card is essentially us saying, how well are you doing? We are looking at government practices. We're holding every government to the same standard based on international law, right? So if you are subjected to crime or instability, if you are a wealthy country or a poor country, we hold all countries to the same standard. We could debate about whether that's the best way to do this, right? Maybe we should give some countries a little bit of leeway on rights violations, but I think the proper place to start is to say, here are what we ask everyone to do. How are we doing? And we can go from there. So in the reports you have, we give a score from 0 to 100. And we look at 25 different human rights. And if a country has widespread violations of that right, they get 0 points. If there are some violations, they get 2. And if there's no evidence of violations, they get 4. And we could create sort of a bigger scale, but one of the things that we've noticed, and I think is more true today than it was in the past, governments like to hide their human rights violations, and I think they're getting better at doing it. So the more precise we try and be, we end up letting off countries that are smart in the way they violate human rights, whereas if we do these sort of larger bins, we have a sense of who the worst violators are, even when they try to hide their violations. We treat every right equally, right? So this aligns with the principle that human rights are indivisible, and it's not perfect. As anyone who has been a student knows, grades are not always a great reflection on how much you've learned, but they're still useful nonetheless, right? And because we have a large number of rights, they're all measured in the same way. They're on the same scale. They're using similar sources of information. This can actually tell us a lot. Before I jump in, I'm going to put some boundary or scope conditions on some of the conclusions we're making here, right? One is all sources of text, all sources of information are biased. And you should be aware that there is a lot of research, particularly in the sources we use, trying to identify what that bias looks like. But before you sort of take what we say as fact, I will always encourage you, double check with other sources and see where people agree with us, where people disagree. That can be really informative. We are always going to be 1 or 2 years behind current events because it takes time for human rights reports to be collected and then for us to score the reports. We don't have errors on the scores I'm going to present today. So, if a country gets a B, it might be a little bit higher or a little bit lower, but it's not going to be much higher or much lower. And finally, we are only looking at government practices, right? So we are not looking at non-state actors, we're not looking at repression carried out abroad, and we're not looking at repression carried out against non-citizens. This last part is something that we're actually working on, repression of refugees and migrants. So I'm not going to say this answers all our questions on human rights, but given these scope conditions, we can learn a lot. So between 2005 and 2021, if you give our score to every country in the world, this is what the distribution looks like. Now, what does that mean? Well, 60% of countries are getting an F. The majority of the world is failing if our goal is to protect human rights, which is really worrisome. And this has not gotten better in recent years. It's not as if in the past few years we see an upward trend. If anything, things have gotten worse since COVID. So there is good reason to worry about this. Less than 20% of countries get an A or B. So 4/5 of countries in the world are getting a grade you probably wouldn't want in a class, right? Which, again, this is worrisome. And these grades tend to be pretty stable over time, right? It's not like things have significantly increased or decreased. COVID, we sort of did see a global decline in human rights, but this is really worrisome because we have more human rights treaties than ever. We have more activists, more NGOs. We have more humanitarian aid. We are paying better attention. Everyone here has a cell phone, which makes it easier to document human rights violations. So by, everything we know, think human rights should be getting better, but they're not. So let's try and figure out why. First, this is our best and worst ranking for 2023. Top 10, bottom 10. And the highest scoring country is Finland, 98 out of 100. And again, this does not mean human rights in Finland are perfect. Finland actually has quite a lot of trouble with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and restrictions on religious freedom. They also have a growing movement to create a homogenous Finnish society. So it is not perfect. But if you had to choose a country to live in to have your human rights respected, I would go with Finland, right? Most of these are developed democracies. And on the other hand, we have Iran, which we give a 0. Iran has been mired in conflict since it had a social movement calling for women's rights, and the government has repressed activists rather violently. In Iran, most of the human rights we care about are violated in a widespread manner. So I think for most people, this wouldn't be terribly surprising, right? The best and worst countries. But I think one of the really interesting things is looking at the countries that have improved or declined the most in recent years. So Nicaragua is our greatest rights reversal for the 21st century. And this is an article I wrote with Ashley Runlet, who's a political scientist here at URI, and Rebecca Lister, who was an MA student here at URI. And we used the C-Rights data to sort of look and see what was happening in Nicaragua and whether there was cause for concern about atrocities. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we found. So on April 18th, 2018, university students took to the streets of Nicaragua. Protests were sparked by security sector reforms that would require workers to pay more money but get fewer benefits. This was a pretty big threat to the Ortega regime, and we know that threat is one of the best predictors of repression. And the protests were large, they were recurring, protesters did not go home, and the Ortega government killed over 300 people. We gave Nicaragua a D in 2005, the first year we scored it. Now it's at an F, and if we look at particularly 2018, which is the second dotted line on this graph, human rights in Nicaragua are really worrisome. We can actually trace the decline of human rights to the Ortega regime. Ortega is elected in the first red dot in 2008, and right away you can see human rights decline. And as human rights decline, we see more and more protests at universities, among workers, among indigenous groups, and we see the government significantly crack down on them. And prior to 2018, and really since 2018, there has been widespread attacks on free speech, on NGOs, universities have been closed, children and workers have been asked to sign petitions saying they support the government if they want degrees or jobs. And we code Nicaragua as having carried out an atrocity in 2018 when it killed those 300 people in the first week of these protests. So one of the things that we're able to do with data like this is say, what happened? What are the big turning points? And we can go back and build a narrative and to do research like we did here and explain what is happening and figure out what the risks of human rights violations are around the world. Now, the second most improved country is Bhutan. And some of you might have heard of Bhutan. A couple years ago, it was the happiest place in the world. Their government has really committed to improving the happiness of their citizens. If we looked from 2009 to 2021, it would be the most improved country, right? A 32-point increase in human rights. We saw a significant decline in the use of repression and significant improvements in worker rights. And really during this whole time, a lot of women's rights were fully respected. It's a good sign, right? There are still problems in the country. It still has a 74. That means there's a long way to go to full respect of human rights. And I am not an expert in Bhutan, right? I'm not an expert in every country's human rights in the world. But what this would allow me to do is say, this is a country we should look at and maybe learn from. How did they improve their human rights 30 points in a 15-year period? What policies did they implement? What were the challenges? And we can learn what those policies are and maybe apply them to other countries that are in the F range and are now getting a C. So one of the things we know is a really good way to improve human rights is to promote democracy. Democracy is a very important aspect of human rights. And there are 3 graphs here. They're all in your report. Autocratic countries, this is what we generally think of as dictatorships. You are not free and fair to choose your leader. Anocratic countries, these are partial democracies, semi-democracies. They have aspects of both democratic and autocratic regimes. And democratic countries. Gold standard is democracy. So if we knew nothing about a country except its regime type, we could look at these graphs and say, if you're an autocracy, the median score is a 28. We would expect an autocratic country to score 28 on our index. If you're an anocracy, it's 46. And if you're a democracy, it's 74. This is consistent with decades of research in political science. Democracy is good for human rights. Democracy is a necessary but not sufficient condition to protect human rights. Because if you'll notice over here, there are some democracies with very low scores. Just being democratic is not enough to protect human rights. but it is a good starting point. And one of the questions that I think we're really going to have to grapple with going forward is, if you are in a democratic country and a sizable number of your citizens want you to repress a minority group, and you run on that as an election platform, then democracy can actually harm human rights. What does this look like? Well, this is a 2017 Pew Research poll on support for torture in the US. And in the US, about half of the country is okay with torturing people. And this is a right under international law that should never be violated under any situation. Why? Well, part of this rise came after the terrorist attack on 9/11. Part of this comes from TV shows about police officers having to get their hands a little dirty to catch the criminal, or movies where you need to torture someone to prevent a bomb from blowing up. Part of this is that people come up with situations where they think it is okay to torture people. And I believe that this is because we don't do much human rights education in this country. Most people don't know what human rights are. Most people don't know that under international law you can't do this. The Convention Against Torture is an international human rights treaty that we have signed as the United States, which says you are not allowed to torture people. Looked at through that lens, I think this number would change. I think fewer people would be okay with torture if they knew that international law says this is never allowed. International human rights law serves as a safeguard to protect the most vulnerable around the world when the majority would like to target them for repression, or when leaders say that the only way you can enjoy rights is if they don't have them. One of the things we're working on is a survey that we're going to launch in the US first, but to try and figure out, what do people know about human rights? Which rights do they want? Which rights do they think are human rights, and which rights do they think, well, maybe that's not really a human right. The right to rest and leisure is not really equal to not being killed by your government. When is it okay to violate rights? And do you want them for yourself and your family? Or do you want them for the group in society you hate the most? Are there some people you think don't deserve human rights? And I think once we learn this, we can start thinking about interventions to inform people about human rights, international law, what the data and research tells us, and shift those attitudes to be more in line with, I want my government to respect every human right. So, a second huge determinant of human rights is population size. All of the largest countries in the world, these are the top 15, tend to have worse human rights than smaller countries. Some projects look at this and they say, well, okay, we need to adjust by population size. Is it really okay to hold China to the same standard that we hold a country with 1 million people? And our argument is yes. Just because you are a large population country does not mean you get to violate rights any more than a small population country. And in many ways, large population countries have advantages that should allow them to respect human rights more. They have more people, they can build economies of scale, they can respect human rights for a lower cost, and yet most of the most repressive countries in the world are large population countries. Up here, you can see the US, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the score we gave to the US, because I imagine that's what everyone is kind of interested in. But give me a second to get there. So one of the things we can do with data like this is make predictions. We can look at what human rights should be in a country, given what we know about that country. We can make predictions about what human rights will be in the future. This is a little bit trickier. We can identify where atrocities are likely to occur and intervene. And I'm going to start with this first bullet point and move to this third one. So In your booklet, you have a plot that looks kind of like this. And if you've taken a statistics course, this is a regression model. We basically put countries on a scale and we say, let's look at countries that are democracies and compare their scores to countries that are autocracies, just like we did before with the scatter plot, and see if changing that leads to a change in human rights. I've added 2 new variables, given what's going on in the world and given the amount of time I had between getting this in and giving this presentation. And 2 of the things we can say is that war is bad for human rights. If you are a country experiencing interstate war or civil war, your human rights will significantly decline. If you are an anocracy or a democracy, your human rights are significantly better than autocratic countries. So this center line, if this bin crosses the center line, it means that that does not help us predict human rights. If everything is to the left, it means having a large amount of the variable reduces human rights. And if it is to the right, it means it improves human rights. This is the human rights model. So decades of research in political science on human rights say these are the things that best help us predict what human rights in a country looks like. Conflict, their regime type, their population. Youth bulge is the percent of your population that is 15 to 24. There's a large literature saying if you have a lot of young people, you're more likely to see conflict, you're more likely to see demands for resources and better rights, and therefore you're more likely to see governments crack down on that country. Wealthier countries do better. Small decline over time, so human rights seem to be getting worse. And then where you are located globally has a huge impact, who your neighbors are. If you're a country and every other country around you is repressive, your human rights will go down through no fault of your own. Similarly, if you are in Europe, your human rights will be better. You are surrounded by countries that respect human rights. So there are neighborhood effects. And one of the things this allows us to do is kind of think through what we would expect a country's human rights to look like if we knew how they did on all of these. So these are the countries, if we were to predict what their human rights are, knowing what we did for that previous graph, that do significantly better than we would expect them to. 10 points or more higher on our index than we would expect them to, given all of their characteristics: war, growth, regime type, population. Australia, Bhutan, Cabo Verde, Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, Finland, Grenada, Samoa. Finland, right? Best country for our rankings. And this tells us Finland does not have the best human rights because they have all of the right conditions to respect human rights. It means they're doing something above and beyond to ensure that their citizens have rights. Similarly, Bhutan, that huge improvement in rights is not what we would expect given the conditions occurring in Bhutan. So if we're looking for lessons for designing institutions to improve human rights, this is a good place to start. On the other hand, these are the countries that score 16 points or more, less than we would expect them to. So if our model said you should get a 50, these are going to get a 34 or less. And these are countries maybe where an intervention is likely to have the biggest effect because the cost of improving rights should be lower. All we need to do is get them back up to where they should be, given what we know about the country. So maybe these are the countries where we have the greatest impact to improve human rights at the lowest cost. One of the biggest threats to human rights is when governments commit atrocities. So we have a definition of atrocity that is a little different than most others. If you go to the UN or you read in the newspaper, you'll hear discussion about genocide. And you can think of genocide as this, where we can prove there was an intent to kill or destroy a significant portion of an ethnic group. We say that we don't really care about intent. That's an issue for the courts. If a lot of people are being killed and one of these other conditions, disappeared, imprisoned, or tortured, that's enough for us to say it's an atrocity. Whether the government did it intentionally or not is a separate issue, right? A large number of people are being targeted and exposed to atrocities. So, what do we get with a definition like this? Well, one thing we get is looking at this and some of the data we have in C-Rights for the BB atrocity measure, brutality-based atrocity, we actually find that if you go online and you look for a list of genocides historically or in any given year, sources don't agree. An article that David and I wrote for the Journal of Conflict Resolution basically said that if we look at the Political Instability Task Force, targeted mass killings, and the Holocaust Museum's atrocity prediction model, none of them agreed on a single case in a year. If we can't even agree what genocides are occurring in any given year, we can't predict them, we can't craft policy to prevent them. So we came up with this measure, and we found that we were able to predict all of those cases and more. One of the things that we've found, and it's a project that is ongoing, is that before the international community says that a genocide is occurring, or in the years leading up to a genocide, our data turns on and says there are atrocities here 3 or 4 years before they occur. Now, if we're thinking about prediction, remember I told you we're always going to be 1 or 2 years behind? This means we have about 2 years to identify a country and craft interventions that could prevent genocide. At the bottom is countries with 3 years of ongoing atrocities for 2019, 20, and 21. I would say these are the list of cases at risk of committing genocide, war crime, crimes against humanity, something that should be investigated by the International Criminal Court and maybe should carry sanctions with it. Okay, on to the main topic, the United States. We give the US a D, and we actually code them as having committed atrocities in 2019 and 2020. 2020 was the response to the BLM protests, where the state routinely attacked peaceful protesters, journalists, bystanders, legal observers, medics, and used disproportionate force in ways that the international community condemned. Attacking journalists is a huge red flag that your democracy is in peril. 2019, it was what we did at the US-Mexico border, abducting children, separating them from their parents, and subjecting them to torturous conditions. Every year, the US kills over 1,000 people in police shootings. And since 2015, this data has been tracked by the Washington Post and picked up by sources like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And we had a very lengthy discussion about whether these killings and the evidence presented in reports rose to the level that we could say that these are widespread violations. Because the government killing its citizens does not automatically make it a human rights violation. If the state investigates the shootings and holds police officers accountable, we wouldn't punish them. And we came to the conclusion that these actually do rise to the level of extrajudicial killings. We also find that the US violates most labor rights, has violations of women's political and economic rights, in recent years has attacked free speech, shooting journalists with less lethal force, with clearly marked credentials, is a violation of free speech. Attacks on NGOs, trying to investigate what's going on at the US-Mexican border, and increasing attacks on the right to protest. If we think of the US as a democracy, a 64 is actually about right. We would actually predict they would get a 66. Right? We give them a 64 because we don't actually code them as a full democracy. After the electoral violence in 2020, after continuing attempts to intimidate election officials, after violence at the Capitol trying to overturn a democratic election, we moved the US back to an anocracy. And we're not the only ones. The Polity 4 project measures democracy around the world. They did the same thing, and they took away our status as the world's oldest democracy. So there are two ways to look at this score, right? One is we are doing significantly better than the model would predict. It's a good thing. The other is that because we have just downgraded from a full democracy to a semi-democracy, if we don't reverse course, human rights are going to significantly decline further. We are likely to lose even more rights than we currently have. So you can take this as a call for action, right? Given what we know about human rights with decades worth of research, if we don't strengthen democratic institutions in this country, human rights will get worse. Okay, so this is all maybe a little depressing, right? The state of the world is a little depressing right now, but I'll show you two things that are less depressing. One is we have put out our global ranking on crights.com. You can look at every single country in the world recognized by the UN and its score. So if you're interested in a country and what its score looks like, check this out. The second thing is we have a data visualization feature on the website. And I'm really proud of this, in part because the code used to create these maps actually came from a student who was working with me on C-Rights data, who was interested in putting together maps. And we worked together to come up with code and create interactive maps where you could click on it. And all of the code used to create these visualizations, I have access to. It's going to be publicly available, and we're going to use it to teach students at URI how to do things like data visualization. And all of this goes hand in hand with sort of our commitment to not just doing research on human rights, but to ensuring that people learn and can interact with data and can interact with academic research in a meaningful way. Everything that we produce is publicly available. If you want to go and replicate what we've done, you can go to crights.com and download our scoring guide. The human rights reports we use are publicly available. Our data is publicly available. And our hope is that people will really engage with this and will really start asking what human rights look like in their country, but more importantly, what they could look like or what they should look like by looking at human rights in other parts of the world. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to bore you, but I'm really glad that you came, and I hope you really take a look at this. Take a look at this report. Call your elected officials and ask for more rights. Political science will tell you that that actually works. So thank you. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. David Cingranelli. So David's a professor of political science at Binghamton University. He was actually my dissertation advisor. I learned how to do political science research from him. And since then, we have been co-authoring many projects on human rights. I will say we're really lucky to have him here. He's widely credited as the creator of the empirical study of human rights and political science. So before he started collecting data on human rights and publishing, you didn't see research on this. He is also a co-director of the C-Rights Project. His book, Human Rights and Structural Adjustment, looks at the impact of IMF and World Bank programs on human rights and conflict. They don't help. And so I'm going to introduce him. Here you go, David. Take it over.
Thank you. Thank you, Skip. So I'm delighted to be here, and want to go back to my nice graphic, but, so I look around the room and I see mostly students, and I want to ask the question, how many of you have had a course in human rights? How many of you have read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Okay, good. Some of those were not students who raised their hands and said yes. So let me just take a step back. And say that I only have a couple of points to make. Skip's had so much good stuff to say that it's going to be hard for you to remember all of it. But you can read the report. You can get a sense for it. And I'll say, the first thing I want to say to you is that what we have here in this report and what's going on at the University of Rhode Island is truly remarkable. Right after World War II ended, the new United Nations, which replaced the League of Nations, created a working group that met in San Francisco, I think for more than a year, to come up with a list of things that governments, list of entitlements that governments should protect for their own people, right? And they did that because Nazi Germany had so clearly violated any sense of propriety and rightness that they felt that something had to be said as a condemnation of what Nazi Germany had done, so it would never happen again. And as Skip said, I think had we not had the Universal Bill of Rights, Bill of Human Rights when we did, it'd be much harder to create now had it not been for the terrible things that Nazi Germany did. So we have this list of ideas that make governments responsible for protecting and promoting certain freedoms, protecting you from things like being tortured, in particular by government officials, allowing you to have freedom of speech, saying that all governments should provide for freedom of religion, no matter what, and for some way for citizens to participate in the selection of government leaders. So that's all laid out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was produced in 1948. And since then, we've had a body, I don't know how many treaties, human rights treaties, that go into much greater detail, elaborate. So the fact that there should be no discrimination based on gender, well, now there's several very specific treaties about, the rights, the equal rights, the kinds of rights that women and men should have equally, right? So that all exists. And what the Sea Rights Project does is we look at the practices of every country in the world and compare it to those strictures or those norms of what government should be doing. And if you get a high score, it means that you're coming, in your actual practices, you're coming pretty close to what the international community says you should be doing. And if you get a low score, then you're pretty far away. Now, the vast majority of research done about human rights is not scientific or quantitative, right? You probably have many people on your faculty who in one way or another study things like women's rights, but from a much more qualitative point of view, right? And then those are great courses, don't get me wrong. But what's special here in this center and in this project is that you're one of the few places in the world that is focusing on measuring the human rights practices of governments. And I think we measure what we care about. The things we don't measure are the things we would rather people not know, right? So the rate at which unarmed black men are killed by police in the United States, we don't measure that. And in fact, there's probably a lot of people who don't want that measured. Because if you measure it and you know what it is, then it kind of demands action. It begs for action, right? And the same thing is going on here when we identify countries on that list of, I thought the list of under and over performers was really very interesting. And the thing is Skip probably could have given you a 1-hour lecture just on how he produced that, or the rights in the United States. He could have done the whole lecture on that. So there's a lot of information there, but I do think that measurement is the first step to conducting systematic research on why some countries violate some kinds of human rights and what the consequences of violations of human rights are, right? We could talk about it and we can learn a lot from talking about it, but until we measure it and begin to see the patterns, the things like Skip was saying about the relationship between democracy and increased respect for human rights, we really can't have evidence-based policymaking, which is what I really care about. I know Skip cares about it, and Meg cares about it. So what's remarkable here is that you have a group of faculty who are interested and who have the expertise to push that agenda forward, which also doesn't exist everywhere. And I must say that, Skip was my student, but at this point in our respective careers, he's way fancier. He's way more able to use those numbers in sophisticated ways to show things than I was than I am certainly now. When I was his age, I was at the frontier, but the frontier is way behind the lines right now. So you're very fortunate to have somebody like Skip and Meg and others on your faculty who are technologically very competent, doing something that very few people are doing, and having the support of the administration. And you've got the center that is mobilized around this effort, which I don't think any other university has. I can tell you Binghamton doesn't have it, right? I don't know any university that does have it. And there's enough of a budget to produce this really fancy report, and you've got people like Kevin, I don't know if Kevin is still here, who is helping to publicize what you guys are doing and make it known to the world. So you've got this blend of education and research and perhaps activism. I don't know. I think it could follow. And I know Skip is interested in many things like that. So, the thing I wanted to say to you is that I'm going to talk about much less than Skip covered. I just want to say to you that the least respected rights, if you look at the list, and I'll show you the list in a moment, what's overrepresented there are labor rights. And I didn't know that until actually Skip did that analysis. I didn't know, right? So we score human rights individually, and what this report does is produce the results in a comparative way that's really edifying, really quite interesting. I mean, what I learned from that report and from work that Skip did before the report was produced is that first of all, worker rights are the least respected rights, and maybe social and economic rights more generally are among the least respected human rights. So civil and political rights are the rights that we have to equal treatment by government and to think of them as democratic rights. So the rights to participate in the political process, the right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, those kinds of things. Those are civil and political rights. And economic and social rights are the right, I think of them as the right to have a decent standard of living. Right? That right to have a government that does the best it can within its available resources to produce a decent standard of living for all members of its society. That's what social and economic rights, in a nutshell, mean to me. And our main example of social and economic rights are the rights of workers to do things like form a trade union, to collectively bargain, to have a minimum wage in society, the right of workers to a minimum wage, to have reasonable limitations on working hours. So those are really important rights, and almost all of us are workers at some point in our lives. I know I am. So I'm not an employer. I get a check. I don't write a check. So I think we all have something at stake in that. And I knew that worker rights in the United States were less respected than some other parts of the world. But I didn't know how it looked globally until this report was produced. And so it was a new discovery. And before this report, I didn't know it. And no one knew it, right? So this is the kind of thing that, in trying to educate people and the public about human rights, is a new discovery, and it's controversial to me, and it will be to many other people. And a little bit later, I'm going to say, I'm going to speculate as to why that would be the case. Right? So the most respected rights, I don't want to spend too long on that, but I want you to get a sense. Remember, these scores, these numbers, could range up to 2. 2 means full respect, and it would mean that all of the 190 some odd countries of the world scored, if the average was 2, the average is in parentheses, scored perfectly. So the right to be protected from being disappeared is the highest, most respected right, but that's a pretty extreme violation of human rights, right? If you're disappeared, that means that you drop out of sight, presumably because of government agents, and nobody knows where you are, right? That used to be more common in the world, especially in the former Soviet Union. That and political imprisonment were pretty common techniques. Over time, that's gotten a lot better. So, not terribly surprising. I guess I'm surprised that it isn't closer to, full respect all over the world. It's still happening in some places. And if you look at that list, so the right of free speech is higher than I thought it would be. I think there's a lot of concern about restrictions on free speech around the world, but at least according to this picture, it's not relative to other rights. It's pretty good. You guys at the University of Rhode Island added this one, the freedom of non-governmental organizations to operate freely within a country. That turns out to be relatively well respected, and I didn't know until people read reports and scored them and so on. I wouldn't know that. In fact, people who say that they could answer questions like this, or which rights are most and least respected, or are human rights improving, without quantifying them, they don't really know. It's purely guess, because how many countries can you know about? So this is really interesting stuff. The ability to associate with others and engage in political protest, fairly well respected, right? Now I'm going to show you the least respected rights. Notice that there is no right on the most respected list that is related to the ability to live a life with a minimum standard of living. The least respected rights. So the first one is not a worker right. It's not a social and economic right. It's what we call a physical integrity right, which by that we mean the right to make sure that your body is not violated by the stuff that your government does, right? So torture is violation of your bodily integrity. That's among the least respected rights. And I'll just say, as an aside, in the literature, among academics, there would be a debate about what torture means and what should be counted as torture. Again, I don't have time to get into that because we could do easily a half hour on that. But look at all these others. I mean, everything except the right to be protected from human trafficking is a labor right. Right? The right to a minimum wage. So remember, a zero would be that there is no recognition by the government that you have an entitlement to that. So that would get scored as a zero, as those of you who have worked on that. And so 0.43 means that the vast majority of countries were zeros on the right to be protected from human trafficking and the right to, I think the two most important worker rights are the right to form a trade union and the right to collectively bargain are really pretty close to the bottom. So not everything in there is a worker right, but there's clearly an overrepresentation. It doesn't, if I had shown you the moderately protected rights, you wouldn't see a worker right in there. They're all in the bottom, and it accounts for most of it. For me, that's a puzzle. So what I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to speculate about why that is. I mean, why would it be that these rights are the least respected human rights globally, on average? And again, I didn't know until I saw this report. So here's what I could come up with. And we don't know the answer, right? I'm just guessing here. So my guesses are that the reason they're among the least respected rights is that the most powerful, influential nations of the world, which are the United States and other countries in Western Europe, don't care. I mean, there's not going to ever be an intervention in a foreign country because they're violating worker rights. But they might give as one of the reasons for intervening in a country violations of other human rights, right? So I think that's possible. And those Western countries have a lot of influence in the United Nations. They don't have more representation than others, but they have bigger delegations. They're really well educated. They're really well financed. Those are the countries that are providing foreign aid. Not only those, but most of the foreign aid comes from them. And they're major donors to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which themselves are influential. So would those organizations push for greater respect for worker rights? There's suspicion that it's precisely the opposite. Right? I don't have time to get into that, but that's my first reason. And as part of my first reason, if I had gone back and redone these slides, I would have made another point, but protecting social and economic rights, like the right to a minimum wage, the right to reasonable limitations on working hours, requires redistribution of wealth within societies. Skip reminded me of that last night at dinner, actually. And he's right. Right? You can protect people from torture without taking the wealth in society and redistributing it from the rich to the poor. But if you provide people with a higher minimum wage, then employers and the owners of corporations will have to take less. Shareholders will take less. Right? So maybe the reason is that they require redistribution. Do you all agree with me that they do require redistribution? But things like protecting free speech doesn't require redistribution of wealth. And the second reason I came up with is that governments directly interfere with the civil and political rights, or promote them, right? Think about freedom of religion. I'm just picking that off the top. They have policies that either require that it be respected or not. Free speech, they either allow people to say what they want or they punish them if they don't. But for worker rights, government doesn't employ most people. The primary actors in deciding whether we all have worker rights, and this is true in every country of the world, are private sector organizations, companies, right? And what the government is doing is regulating what those companies can do so they can't give people a wage lower than a certain amount per hour, that the number of hours per week that you can work without being paid overtime isn't too high. So government acts as a regulator for many economic and social rights, not as a direct provider. And I think that that's true for the other things like housing, food, education. Well, education is another one, I think, where the government is the direct provider. But most of them, I would say, they're not. So, and with worker rights, they're clearly not. Next one is that while the other human rights are established through treaties written by the United Nations and ratified by the United Nations, worker rights are established by the International Labor Organization, which is a UN-affiliated organization. I don't think that should matter too much, but most people don't know about the International Labor Organization. I'm guessing most of you don't. How many of you had heard of it before I said International Labor, the ILO? Yeah, a few hands went up. Congratulations to you. I mean, at your age, I didn't know, right? And I'm talking to the students here in the group. But it was formed by the United Nations in 1917, so it's even older than the United Nations. And it was formed, I think, in response to the Russian Revolution and not wanting to see similar revolutions elsewhere in capitalist countries. Right? So maybe that has something to do with it. And the last thing I would point out to you is that powerful non-governmental organizations, so they are organizations, any organization outside of government is non-governmental. They measure national performance on some civil and political rights, and I give the example of Freedom House there. I think people have all heard about Freedom House. But few, if any, measure national performance on providing economic and social rights. And again, I'm coming back to where I started. The lack of numerical scores implies that they are less important, right? So the fact that Sea Rights and other projects don't rate the performance of governments around the world on economic and social rights, preventing homelessness, hunger, those kinds of things, means that we don't have a good idea of who's doing a good job and who's doing a really bad job. And the indicators that do exist, and this is my but not so fast slide. So maybe we're just wrong. Maybe it's only worker rights that are disrespected around the world, and other economic and social rights are much more fully respected. We don't know. Right? That's our challenge, is to figure that out. And I'm sure that those of you who sign up for classes with Skip and Meg in the future will play a part in that. I know I'm working on that now with Skip and actually another person at the University College of London. And I actually think this is going to turn out to be true for all economic and social rights, that they're going to be less respected. But I don't know. It's my hypothesis for the reasons that I gave you on the last slide. But we're going to try to measure national performance on a wider set of economic and social rights, like education, health care, drinkable water, housing, food, and so on. These are all either explicitly mentioned in the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or they're implied. And now we're adding things like the right to a government that will protect the air we breathe, the water already the water we drink, is done through resolutions. I don't know if there's really a treaty yet on that. And I'm coming to the end now, so don't get too nervous. But I just want to say it's not easy. We would have done it by now if it was easy. It's hard because the existing indicators that exist are unfair to less economically developed countries. In fact, to just tell you a little story, until Ronald Reagan's presidency, under Jimmy Carter, there was a section of the annual Human Rights Report produced by the US government on economic, social, and cultural rights. Because Jimmy Carter and his Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, thought that they were really important. And they knew that the leaders of less developed countries thought they were really important. But the indicators, the numbers that were being used in that report were unfair and they were raw indicators of achievement. So let's take the percentage of the population with access to safe drinking water, which is available now for all countries of the world. But if we just look at the raw indicators of performance, uncorrected by anything, what you see is that rich countries always protect economic and social rights the best. There's no way to do what Skip did earlier and say, well, who's given the advantages and disadvantages of Norway? What should they be doing? And are they under or overperforming? And that's the approach we want to take to economic and social rights. Let's control for, let's consider the things that make it easy for Norway to do it, make it really hard for Sudan to do it. They just don't have as much water, they have a different climate. And only doing it based on wealth isn't going to be enough. So there are some existing studies that are trying to adjust the indicators of performance strictly on the basis of GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita. So we could, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty there, but we could adjust them just for wealth. But I'm going to I just have, I think, one more slide. So think about providing clean, fresh water to 100% of the population, which, by the way, is the United Nations goal, that 100% of the people in every country should have access to clean, fresh water, drinkable water, by 2030. Ain't going to happen, folks. It just isn't going to happen, right? It's such an unrealistic target there. But one of the reasons it's not going to happen is it's not only up to political will to make it happen. If you've got a certain kind of geography, it's going to be way harder. If you have a certain kind of climate, hot rather than cold, harder. If you're subject to natural disasters, can't do it. So I think I hit the wrong button. And this last one is one I think is really interesting to think about. And that is, there are people making the argument now, especially from the developing world, that some of the problems that are occurring, thank you, Meg, some of the problems that countries are having reaching these economic and social rights targets are legacies of colonialism, right? So, for example, was the country that we're talking about a colonizer, or was it colonized? And I would say it's probably the case that colonizers are doing better today, right? How recent was independence? I think long independence is an advantage over African countries, which tend to have relatively poor human rights practices in general, and I'll bet economic and social rights outcomes in general, are among the more recently independent countries in the world. How violent was colonial rule? Peaceful rule is an advantage. Did colonization result in an unequal distribution of land, which is a really big deal in Latin America, And if that happened, then more equal distribution is an advantage. And I could go on. So the last one is direct or indirect rule. The United States was ruled indirectly. There were colonial legislatures that had some, and I would think that indirect rule was an advantage. And I'm going to stop there because we have really a bunch of great student presentations, I know, coming up soon. And thank you for your attention.
Take a 2-minute break so that we can do the shuffle that's currently going on, and then we're going to have a Q&A with Dr. Signorelli and Dr. Mark.
Thank you. You too. You had so much more information in your presentation. Really, I felt like I could have spent 15 minutes on most of your slides.
I'm excited about the economic and social rights measures that we're developing,
Yeah,
particularly the colonial legacy.
yeah, and I think I played off of your under and over performer. I think that's what we're really talking about.
Yeah. Let me check in with Topton.
Is it okay?
That's good, no, you're way ahead, so.
Good. I'm glad. I hope it makes some of them more interested in human rights. Really?
No, you're good.
And I know what I said about this being a very special place, because I can't think of another place where this is happening.
Where there's so much institutional.
Yeah, I feel that.
So I'm looking forward to seeing the posters. Do you think that they'll be available later, or will all of the students?
There's 17 of them.
Yeah.
I guess that's
So many more than are presenting today.
yeah, I think the presentations are like 4 or 5 of them. Posters equal 7.
I edited one part about
Good morning.
scoring on we changed part around, but otherwise,
Sorry, I missed the first part. I had to get all my stuff.
deal with read.
It's like garbage.
The computer recorded good. That was recording the computer. Her computer was all the music cameras. We were using my computer basically just as a microphone. I don't know. Oh, yeah. First try. We tried to record it. This goes perfect. Go right back there. You wrote the whole script? That's very least equal to what we did reading it. Maybe I would argue way more.
All right, everyone, if we could take the next 30 seconds and sort of head back to our seats. We're going to do the question and answer on the state of human rights with Dr. Signorelli and Dr. Mark. So as you're thinking about your questions, if you could raise a hand or something, I'll come over with the microphone so that we can all hear you.
Somebody out there take pity on us and ask us a naive question. Any question. Yes.
So I had a question regarding your point that about like economic and social rights being protected a lot less. Oh, thank you. What do you think are some of the challenges or restrictions that are causing governments not to regulate those rights as well? Because even though they're not directly involved, you talk about how they have the possibility of regulating those rights, especially regarding like wealth distribution. What are some of the biggest obstacles?
Start with that? You want to? Sure. Go ahead.
I think one of the limitations is a lot of people don't think of those as human rights, right? They think of them as kind of, it's a bargain, it depends on the budget and the resources, and it's a lot less clear, again, because we don't have indicators, what would it reasonably look like to give citizens that right? Like, we have a lot less clear demands, right? More access to health care and water, yes, but like how much is reasonable given the limitations? I also think they're just more controversial. We've seen from decades of research on social movements, it is cheaper to give people free speech than to give people social security, right? So it costs more political will from leaders to actually provide those rights. And I think the final thing is that these are just not the rights that were promoted when the UN was created. These tended to be the rights that the USSR and more recently China and a lot of Asian countries have prioritized. And so they've been kind of held against civil and political rights, which might change, right? As China's power globally rises, I think these rights will become more important and maybe we'll see a decline in importance for civil and political rights. And I think it'll be interesting to see what happens.
So I agree with everything Skip just said, and I just want to add this, that if you're among political scientists here, we can talk about economic and social rights, but if we were talking with economists, their eyes would glaze over, because in the eyes of most economists I know, how much a country does for the disadvantaged in its society is a matter of their choice, right? It's, if you have democracy, that governments, people should decide how much they want to help the poor, and how much they don't want to help the poor. And that's a very different perspective from the human rights perspective, which says all governments have the responsibility to do everything within their available resources to help the poor. So there's an ideological thing here. Economists come from a neoliberal ideology, and political science not so much.
So you were talking about kind of the difference between the qualitative human rights and then this is the quantitative. So how do you square the difference between, like, I know that there's differences between qualitative and quantitative political research. Is there a debate in between these two fields, like your research project and other human rights qualitative research projects? Is there a dichotomy there, and what is that like?
You want me to go?
You can
Okay,
take this
so
one.
I love that question. Thank you for that question. I've been wrestling with that question for years because the Human Rights Institute of Binghamton is meant to have transdisciplinary research that involves both people in the humanities and people in the social sciences. There aren't so many people in the social sciences who study human rights. So we're overwhelmed by the humanities. And it seems, I think, so what I've learned from interacting with them for 7 or 8 years now is that they have much more fine-grained information about what goes on. They do case studies, and they know how rights get violated, and they have some ideas about why that it's happening in some societies, or in the place that they studied versus others. And I see that information that they collect as something that social scientists couldn't do on their own, and can be the basis for a generalization that might be tested. So I think we can work together, but it's not easy to get a collaboration that is fruitful. I tried working, I am working with some people on prisoners' rights. They come from a qualitative position, I come from this quantitative approach, and, you know, we're getting someplace, but it's hard work.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add that you need both, right? I think scholars tend to silo themselves off and say, well, I'm really good at this, but I don't really know how to do qualitative research. And scholars aren't very good at saying, I don't know how to do something, so they pretend, maybe they pretend it's not quite as important, right? But I think, you know, an over-reliance on data is dangerous, and you actually do need people who are doing case studies and pointing out where something might not line up. If you just focus on data, you can be fooled into thinking that you're accurately capturing the world. When, you know, we can look around at case studies and someone says, well, I know human rights in Nicaragua, yes, that's accurate. And they might look at a different country and say, I think you've gotten something wrong there. And then we can go back and kind of fix it, right, and adjust our methodology. So there needs to be more of a back and forth dialogue, but I think as David said, it's really tough. We don't have many good examples of transdisciplinary research. It's time consuming and there's not a lot of funding for it. Other questions?
So I'm in Professor Mark's human rights class right now, and something that we talked about that I found really interesting was how culture plays a role in whether or not like something's regarded as a human right, especially with social and economic rights, especially in the West. It's with capitalism, it's really ingrained in our culture, I think, to view working long hours and those things that we regard as a human right violation as being noble or good, or you're a good worker. I was wondering what your thoughts are maybe on how culture like globally affects whether or not people like will fight for their rights, or even if those things should be considered like a right, just based on culture.
So I have an answer for that. You want me to go first?
You can go first.
So I think that if we look at the world, there are two kinds of societies. There are liberal societies where the purpose of government in liberal societies is to allow all individuals to achieve their full potential and to have maximal freedom as long as they don't interfere with the freedom of others. But it's based on government's role is to maximize the potential of the individual members. There's other kinds of societies, and I would say maybe most of the world is not so individualistic, is not so liberal, it's more communitarian, where the purpose of government isn't so much to maximize individual freedom, but is to produce a kind of community that is the best community for nurturing and producing peace and tranquility and the best life for all. And so I think one of the obstacles, and culture captures that difference. And so how do we, and I think probably, I don't know, 2/3 of the world is communitarian rather than liberal. It took me a while to figure that out, because when I was your age, I thought everybody wanted the same thing. And I'm realizing now not so much. And is it realistic to want everybody to believe in the liberal view of the world or not? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I agree, right? I think what we think we are entitled to is driven by culture, right? So one of the things we showed is like what countries around you look like affects your human rights. I think that's true for individuals, right? What your community at the local, state, national thinks are the things, the values that are important to your country. Those are the things that you tend to protect. I'd also say, human rights is one way of looking at the world and, trying to achieve dignity for everyone, but it's not the only one. So I've heard, for example, indigenous activists sort of say, they really don't like the human rights approach because it is a very Western, individual-centered focus, right? And it's all about, I have all of these rights, but I have no obligations to the community, right? And in early debates at the UDHR, for example, one of the things that got cut was whether there should be a maximum wage. That is, should we allow societies where one person owns everything, or should there be a limit? And so these debates have always kind of existed in human rights about should you limit someone's well-being to ensure other people have a decent standard of living? And I think different cultures come up with different answers to that. So right now we are in kind of a very individualistic world where the most powerful countries are pushing kind of human rights as the framework. But I don't think it always has to be that way. And I think thinking about our obligations as citizens to each other is kind of at the core of a lot of these debates around human rights and why we don't have them.
Thank you.
What role do you think AI will have on the future for these types of studies?
I'll take this one. Well, we're going to have a really good presentation on digital repression by Yulia in just a little bit. So I won't give away the spoiler, but I will say that there's some really interesting work right now using AI to score more documents, right? So one of the projects I'm working on with a couple of researchers at Leiden and Binghamton is to use machine coding to look at every newspaper article and identify human rights event violations. Who was targeted and who carried out the repression. And there are a lot of challenges to this, but the technology is now there, where previously we were doing this by hand, reading 10,000 news articles and you get through 1 or 2 countries. Soon we'll be able to sort of do a lot more. So I think it will allow us to identify way more information and get through it at a faster rate. So we will get better at measuring this stuff. The downside is governments are also actively interfering with this. So if I want to analyze tweets, I need to be able to figure out which ones are real, which ones are bots, which ones are sort of misinformation, and that gets tricky. So I think it's a cycle. As we get better at using technology to identify human rights violations, governments then get better at hiding them. And then we have to get better at finding them, and then governments get better at hiding them. And so it's kind of a never-ending cat and mouse game. But I think if used cleverly, and we're seeing activists use these technologies really in innovative ways, I think it can improve human rights.
Is AI a threat to human dignity?
Yes.
So I thought that was also part of your question, and that's the hardest thing. We're struggling with that now, right? That question is being raised by many. And it may limit opportunities for decent work in the future. People get their identities from their work. So I don't know the answer to that, and I'm sure that's just a little piece of the potential threat to human dignity. It's an interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, there is lunch and food. Why don't we grab some food, and then we're going to set up, and we're going to have student presentations, which are going to be really amazing. And then we are going to have a student poster session where I'll encourage everyone to kind of get up, walk around, ask questions, learn a little bit about the posters. All right, we'll start up again at 4. we're going to get started back up. So if you want to just grab a seat, we have a really great presentation by Amanda and Aliha. Give them your full attention.
Hello everyone. We coded for the right NGO autonomy and security this past summer, and I am Amanda.
I'm Aliha.
So, what is NGO autonomy and security? So, NGOs are non-governmental organizations. Even though they're non-governmental organizations, so it means it's not necessarily affiliated with government, they do write reports about the government, what's going on in the country that they are stationed in, and it's really important that that they have cooperation from the governments when they write their reports, and that they are able to operate effectively within the country. The Declaration on Human Rights Defenders was adopted by the UN General Assembly in '98, so that means that it is laid out in international law that human rights defenders, so NGO workers, have the rights to freely operate in a country.
So a little bit more on who we are and what we did. We were summer research fellows for the university's College of Arts and Sciences, and this was one of the projects that was given to us. When it was first given to us, we received data from 2005 to 2022 that was mostly already coded, and our job was to look at special cases that a code either couldn't be settled on or there was no code at all. And we looked at these cases using the US State Department reports, and we came up with our own scores and then compared it to the scores that were either already there or the scores that were being debated. And then we worked as a team to reconcile these scores, come up with a decision, make a case for why we thought a country should be given a certain number, and then we looked at it as a whole and found trends in our data. So when we are coding for NGOs, this is what we're looking for. We want to make sure that the government can allow an NGO to be formed in the first place and then maintain their longevity as an organization. We want to make sure that they're able to research and receive information on human rights and then publicize this information, especially if there are criticism of human rights and any human rights violations. They want to make that information public. They should be allowed to critique policies by the government that impede human rights on the citizens of that country, and that there is protection for them under law as human rights workers. And also just the ability to receive resources in order for them to continue to operate and protect human rights in that country.
All right, so now we're gonna go a little bit more into the coding of this right. So this right is scored on a scale from 0 to 2, so 0 meaning no respect at all for this right, and 2 meaning the highest level of respect for this right. So if a country receives a 0, it means that they're either getting harassed in a violent manner, or they're unable to operate within a country. This might be the state abolishing or outlawing NGOs, and just creating other barriers that make it really hard to operate in that country. So an example of a 0 is seen in Afghanistan in 2021. We gave them a 0 because they intervened in the operations of international organizations and non-governmental organizations, meaning it was really hard for them to operate or effectively operate in the country. On top of that, the Taliban asked the staff obtain a security clearance and pay a 30% tax on salary. Again, one of those barriers that are making it impossible or near impossible to operate within a country. And on top of that, the Taliban conducted house-to-house searches, which can be considered an overstep in privacy. Now, when a country receives a 1, it means that they're able to operate within that country, but they just experience a lot of barriers and harassment from the government, again, making it hard to operate in that country, but not making it impossible to operate in that country. And a lot of times in the reports, they mention self-censorship. So the countries, if the countries had to be, if the governments caused the NGOs to if the government caused certain NGOs to engage in self-censorship, that's another reason why we would also give it a 1. So an example of this is Algeria in 2021. So we gave them a 1 because there was varying degrees of government restrictions, and there were several major civil associations remained unrecognized but tolerated. Again, they were able to operate in the country, but there were just so many barriers when it came to that operation.
Moving on to a score of 2, this is when human rights NGOs are able to operate freely within a state without the government being too much of a hindrance. However, the government might not always cooperate. They sometimes might not cooperate at all with what they are publicizing. An example of this is Bulgaria in 2021. These international human rights groups, both domestic and domestic human rights groups, were able to operate without government restriction and not crazy overstepping by the government, but there were uneven levels of cooperation from government officials. And then for a score of a 3, this is the highest score a country can get. This is when NGOs can operate without any government restriction and the government officials in that country are genuinely cooperative and responsive to what they publicize. An example of this is Albania in 2021. They were able to operate without any government restrictions. They were able to publicly show their findings, and the government officials were cooperative and responsive to their views and their suggestions.
All right, now that we've gone over the coding and the coding scheme, we want to look now at the data, specifically the data for the 21st century. When you look at the map over here, you can see that there are a couple trends. A couple countries in more northern Africa and Middle East had lower respect for these NGO rights. But the thing about NGO rights, and as we were coding and going over the reconciliation of these scores, we noticed that a lot of times certain countries that you would assume would have lower scores because they are less developed, part of the global south, or because there's a lot of civil conflict going on, that they would respect NGO rights at a lot lower rate, or there would be a lot higher human rights violations within this category. But actually, a lot of countries proved differently. One country I really want to point out is Haiti over here. The past 3 years, Haiti has actually improved their scores and has received a score of 3. So from 2019 to 2022, they have received a score of 3 under this category. And a lot of people would think because there's a lot of civil unrest happening in Haiti that you would just assume that NGO rights and autonomy would be a lot lower. So this calls on further data to really examine why certain countries restrict NGOs and why certain countries don't restrict NGOs. So when we are coding the data, it's important to consider a couple of things. So there are going to be situations where NGOs are in the wrong. If you come across that in the reports, you do not hold that against the country, and that does not affect the country's score. We just solely focus on how countries treat and respect the rights of NGOs within their country, so the government. And then also there's cases where the report talks about individual human rights activists. Again, these cases are not considered because we're talking about the bigger organization and how the government treats that bigger organization. So moving forward, again, we want to look at closely analyzing the trends within the data to see why countries protect or prohibit rights of NGOs. This can just enhance our knowledge and understanding of how the government and NGOs work together. And I would also like personally to see more information about the United States, because we have limited information about how the United States treats NGOs, and we only have information about that for the past couple of years.
Also, this is important to note that NGOs, their goal is to promote social or political change or help those in need in that country. So it's really important that the governments do what they can to protect these organizations and make sure that they have everything that they need in order to complete this work, and also that the citizens in that country have access to the information on what their government's doing, and if they have any cases against them, the citizens should have a right to know. So it's really important that NGOs are able to complete this work and have the ample resources to do so.
Stand by here. Do we have to wait?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Maya McNeil,
I'm Sarah Barber.
and today we're going to talk about women's social rights. So we are undergraduate students that are enrolled in Dr. Brendan Skipmark's Political Science 360 Human Rights course, and we are also interns for the Center for Nonviolent Studies. And what we did is we conducted content analysis on government reports for women's social rights from 2005 to 2016 and 2021 to 22 for both law and practice.
All right, so first I'm going to take you through what our scoring process looks like. So listed on the screen, you can see all of the rights that are coded for under women's social rights. 14 rights. A country doesn't violate any. If a country doesn't violate any of these rights, then it's going to receive a 3 for law and practice. If a country only violates 1 or 2 of these rights, that country receives a 2. If it violates 3 or 4, that country receives a 1, and 5 plus violations is a 0. So just another thing to consider, there's a couple special cases. Any country where female genital mutilation is not protected by law or illegalized in the law, that country automatically receives a 1. In addition, if the government officials were reported to carry out forced abortions or forced sterilizations of women, that country also automatically receives a 1, and so forth. Another important thing to keep in mind when considering how we score women's social rights is we only count, we only qualify a violation if women don't have rights on the same basis as men. For example, I'll give you the example of child marriage. We do code for the freedom of from child marriage, but only on the basis of how equal it is to men. So if in a country, for example, the minimum age for marriage is 16 for both men and women, we would not code for that. That would not count as a violation under women's social rights. But if for men, the minimum age was 18 and for women it was 15, we would code that in as a violation. So, slide. So I am curious to see what you guys think is the most violated of these rights. Here's your list. Any guesses? Yes. Education. Interesting. Anything else? Yes. Divorce. Yeah, definitely. All right, education and divorce. Yeah, those are both really valid answers. But in our research, we actually found that marriage rights and equal inheritance rights were the most violated of women's social rights. And when we talk about marriage rights, we mean the right to enter marriage on an equal basis as men, the right to divorce on an equal basis as men, freedom from child marriage, and equal authority over children. All right, and I'll hand it over to Sarah.
I'm just going to use this one. Okay. Good afternoon. I am a part of a group that scored women's social rights for a list of countries from 2005 to 2016. Here, we are taking a closer look at 3 of these countries, specifically out of the Middle East and North Africa region: Syria, Algeria, and Morocco. When looking at the United States State Department report on Syria, one of the main patterns is that in addition to secular laws, customary Sharia played a heavy influence in the implementation and protection of women's social rights. Sharia is customary Islamic law based on the Quran, the Hadith, which are teachings of Prophet Muhammad, and interpretations by Islamic scholars that outline or govern aspects like marriage, divorce, inheritance, and family relationships in Islam, which is why we will talk about it probably multiple times throughout our presentation. Throughout this presentation, let me skip. Sorry. In Syria, the rights to equal inheritance, the right to enter into marriage on the basis of equality of men, the right to initiate divorce, freedom from child marriage, and the right to raise and make decisions regarding children with equal equality to men or husbands were consistently violated from 2005 to 2016 in both law and practice, which is why you see zeros across the board from 2005 to 2016, and same with Algeria, because they both violated more than 5 of the criteria points. So in Algeria, women commonly suffered from discrimination in inheritance claims, the right to enter into marriage on a basis of equality with men, the right to initiate divorce, and basically it's the same stuff I mentioned for Syria. So essentially, most of the women's social rights that mentioned, quote, with or inequality to men or husbands were violated. Another trend is that Algeria has a strong presence of Sharia within the country. When it comes to Morocco, Sharia also packs inheritance laws and issues with enforcing practices of child marriage. As you can see in the tables for Morocco, it scores a 2 across the board in both law and practice, with the exception of practice in 2005 with a score of 1. So this indicates that when it comes to women's social rights, Morocco has better or more progressive and protective laws and enforces the implementation in said laws in comparison to other countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. And I found Morocco to be an interesting and tad more difficult case to score because the information in the report is a little more ambiguous than, say, the report of the violations in Syria, Algeria, and it made it more complicated to score, but I will touch upon this a little bit later.
Awesome. So I'm going to be taking you through the Latin American and Caribbean island countries for 2021 and their respect for inheritance and marriage rights. So this chart right over here includes all of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean islands. And you can see on this chart that there's actually very few widespread violations of these rights. Our law scores are in blue and our practice scores are in red. But you can see Cuba is the only country that received a 0 in both law and practice. In fact, none of the other countries received a 0 for practice or law. 25 of the Latin American Caribbean countries reported violations of women's rights. 16 of those 25 countries reported marriage rights, and 13 of those 16 countries reported child marriage as occurring in those countries. So as you can kind of see, marriage is like a really widespread violation when we take into women's social rights into consideration. So I want to speak a little bit more to the example of Cuba. They scored a 0 because government officials were actually reported to have carried out forced abortions and sterilizations on women. So that's why you see them score so low. But they also reported this disparity in child marriage. You see girls aged 14 or older and boys aged 16 and or older. So that counted as a violation towards child marriage. We also point towards El Salvador. That was just a general example of, a 3 country. They reported no women's social rights violations. I do want to mention Peru, just as another example of how we code for child marriage. 80% of the teenagers who were married in Peru were women. So we coded that as a violation in practice, not in law, because it was protected in law. And one last country I want to point towards is Venezuela. I will be touching on it a little bit later, but they actually surprisingly scored, surprisingly, depending on what your thoughts are, they scored a 3 for women's social rights. And Venezuela scores really low when you look at the map that you saw earlier. So it was a little bit surprising to see Venezuela score a 3 for women's social rights, and I'll talk a little bit more about what those implications are later on. And this is just like a visual representation so you can see that women's social rights are actually really widely respected in Latin America. You see only very few violations, practice scores are always lower, but you only see a few countries falling below when it comes to practice. So, it's really impressive to kind of see how that regional difference is when you talk about women's social rights.
Today, I wanted to focus on Asia, and when scoring Asia, some countries that stuck out to me were Japan, Indonesia, and Laos. As you can see, Japan had a shift in child marriage from 2021 to 2022, and men had to be 18 to marry, while women only had to be 16. And in 2022, this law became equal. This interested me because I assumed Japan wouldn't violate these laws because of the resources that they have, and I think this assumption that I had is a good example of the unconscious bias that coders do face. For Indonesia, Indonesia scored a 1 in law and a 0 in practice in 2022. While the law was equal, child marriage still frequently occurred in certain areas. Violations occurred for both law and practice because widows did not receive equal inheritance. And lastly, Laos scored a 3 in law but a 1 in practice because they violated both child marriage and inheritance. Overall, regarding Asia, a trend I noticed for countries that violated child marriage was the driving forces were low income, poverty, rural locations, and cultural traditions. For inheritance, the reports were mostly vague and about details, but there was a general trend of unequal inheritance for widows.
So to summarize, we are now seeing that our claims that inheritance laws in marriage, especially child marriage, were found to be supported by the data. As for points of contention, and I think I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but overlapping criteria and vague information in the U.S. State Department report can contribute to discrepancies in scoring. For example, I discussed Morocco and how I found it a little more difficult to score, and that's because there aren't specific statements about inheritance in other marriage laws, but in the report it states, quote, "The Family Status Code governs family and estate cases, even in cases in which the law provides for equal status and cultural norms often prevent a woman from exercising her rights." So based on this given info, in the report and the key words estate and family, there could be some questions that scorers may have which could lead to different outcomes of scores. So for example, can this apply when inheritance isn't explicitly stated? What about the right to participate in social or cultural activities? AKA, is this statement too general to count for a specific criteria point, or could it apply to multiple? In this case, I had to clarify with Professor Mark because, and it was just very complicated, and so then I had to also refer to the code book, compare with my group members who previously scored Morocco, and triple check the US State Department report to be sure that my scores were hopefully accurate. In this case, we found that this statement, though vague, can be applied to more than one violation criteria. Another issue is absent information. So if the US State Department report does not mention anything about, say, inheritance claims or the right to transfer citizenship, you have to assume that it didn't violate that law for that year or practice. In this, I think this aspect of scoring did help address any internal biases like Maya mentioned a little bit earlier, like assuming that this country should get a 0 because of what you heard about it on the news, or this country is so great so you assumed it would have a 3 in women's social rights. With the CI rights scoring of women's social rights, it's really important that we check our biases at the door and aren't quick to make assumptions. We think that moving forward, it would be helpful to have more specific and clear guidelines that address common scoring questions and discrepancies and explicitly state what should or should not be considered when scoring. And even though we do have these guidelines within the report already, I think addressing questions that commonly asked questions that scorers have whenever they're going through this report could be helpful to have more standardized scoring. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, one frustration that we think was common among people who scored women's social rights was the fact that even if a report discusses that women were often physically violated and abused, we could not consider that when scoring as it belongs to the physical integrity rights category. We believe that it would be beneficial if we were to not just address physical violence and physical integrity rights, but to have a separate category labeled as women's physical integrity rights that included any reports of disproportionate physical violence and assault against women, and also highlights the lack of resources and access for mothers, like prenatal care, right to an abortion, or reproductive health care.
And that brings us back to the example of Venezuela. I'm not sure if you remember, but they scored a 3 for women's social rights. But it was, difficult reading the report because in Venezuela, birth control is extremely expensive. It's birth control pills are 10 times the monthly minimum wage, which is insane. There's a huge lack of prenatal care and obstetric. I can't say that word. Prenatal care for women who are pregnant, and there's a high amount of teen pregnancies as well because of that very restricted access to birth control. And as a result of all of these factors, there's a really high maternal mortality rate in Venezuela. And that's something you see in a lot of countries is these high maternal mortality rates, lack of health care for women. And I think that would fit well into like a women's physical integrity right, if that were to possibly be added to the scores. And yeah, I think that would be a really great way to kind of see exactly how women's physical integrity do get threatened, because Venezuela's score would be much lower if that was taken into account.
Overall, we are very grateful to have had the opportunity to work on the CI Rights Project and to work with Dr. Skip Mark and the Center for Nonviolence and Peace Studies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take on this one. The non. Okay, cool. So click on this, okay? Yeah. Okay. The clicker's not working. Hello, everyone. I'm back. This time I'll be talking about Indigenous rights. This is a right I coded when I actually took Professor Skip Mark's 360 Human Rights class last semester. So Indigenous rights were formally recognized in 2007 by the UN. In the Declaration for Indigenous Rights of Indigenous People, they recognize that Indigenous people should have rights to their land, they should have the right to express their culture, and they should have the right to government services. Based on the information, the CI Rights database measures this right under 8 different categories. These 8 categories are general respect, autonomy, discrimination, land, culture, education, labor, and health. And in this presentation, we'll be going through all of these 8 different categories and be giving examples of each scoring for these categories. So the coding guidelines for every single category, it is not going to vary. If a country receives a 2, that means that they protected this right in law and practice. If a country receives a 1, it means that they protected this right in law but not in practice. And if they receive a 0, this means that the country did not protect it in either law or practice. And if we score countries with a 0.5, it just means that we did not have information to give that country a score for that category. So the first one we're going to be talking about is general respect. So general respect is when indigenous people should be extended all the human rights and fundamental freedoms extended to all members of the international community. Government practices should include prevention or redress of general disrespect and recognition of indigenous groups. So how does this look like when we are coding? So we give countries a 2 if we see that they are identified in the legislation, and actually the legislation is strong enough where they're able to exercise these rights in any way, so they're able to exercise their constitutional rights. We give a country a 1 under this right if we see, again, it's protected in law, but they're not able to exercise it in practice, and then a 0 if it's not recognized in either. Next is autonomy. So Indigenous people should be able to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully, if they choose so, in the political, economic, social, cultural life of the state. Political systems may include the right to self-govern, political representation in legislative bodies, or other functions of the government. So when we look at the scoring, I just really want to point out Burundi in 2020 because they did a really good job at protecting this right. Not only did they make sure that the 12 people, which were, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that in any way, but that is an indigenous group inside this country, they made sure that they had representation within the main government, so they were a part of the decision-making body. And they also did a really good job of informing the 12 people of how to be representative and how they could vote in the upcoming elections. And then If a country receives a 1, like Venezuela, again, in the Constitution, they state that they should have the representation, they should have seats in the government, but they don't have any representation at all. And then a 0, again, not protected in law or practice. So next, we're going to move on to discrimination. Discrimination is when Indigenous people must have access to all basic government services, food, water, and protection. Adequate measures should be taken so there is no language barrier preventing Indigenous people from accessing these services. So again, we're going to follow the same scoring guideline that we've been following for the other ones, but one that I really want to point out is Mexico for 2021. They received a 0, and the reason I want to point this out is because of the marginalization specifically to Indigenous women. So Indigenous women tend to be the most, in this group, right, tend to receive less respect in general, and they tend to face the most discrimination, which is something to think about when you are coding this right. And then next we're going to move on to land. So Indigenous people should have the right to control and develop the land they have traditionally owned and used. Indigenous people shall not be subject to forced relocation. So this category specifically is the most violated category out of all the 8 categories. This is because a lot of Indigenous ancestral land is on very valuable resources, and it's not necessarily the government that is kicking them out all the time. A lot of times it is businesses or multi-corporational organizations that want to use this land for the resources that it has, like oil and minerals. And a lot of the times the government does not do anything to stop this. But I do want to point out Cameroon in 2016 because they did a really good job in securing the land for Indigenous people and making sure that they were not getting removed out of their Indigenous land. They did this by conducting community meetings, making sure that they're getting their basic needs, and making sure that the Indigenous people are not facing land pressures from outside sources. So again, the government actively being part of the Indigenous community and making sure that their land rights are protected. Next, we're going to move on to culture. So Indigenous people must be able to preserve their culture. Indigenous people should be recognized by the state's constitution. Indigenous people should feel free to practice, express, and teach their cultural traditions and customs. So when you are scoring this this category specifically, a lot of times you'll see countries do National Day of Indigenous People, and just because they do that, they don't automatically get a 2. A lot of times it is performative. So in this example, you see that Cameroon did that, but the reason why we gave Cameroon a 2 is because they actually recognize the culture of these people and not just saying, we just have this one day for Indigenous people. They actually did events, they did speeches, expositions of artifacts, traditional medicines, and much more. So actually recognizing the Indigenous people and their culture. And I also want to point out Uganda in 2021, because in this it talks about how Indigenous people weren't able to express their cultural practices or religious practices because they were removed from their ancestral land. And the land category and the culture category are very closely connected because a lot of Indigenous people practice their cultural traditions through their land and their ancestral land. Next, we're going to be moving on to education. So Indigenous people have the right to control their own education system and have access to education and their language and respecting their culture when possible. So when we look at the scoring guideline, we score countries a 2 when they actually put investment into the education system for Indigenous people and are actually giving them access to education, both in legislation and practice. Again, we give countries a 1 when they say in law that they must provide them certain education, like must provide them free school books, but they actually suffer from exclusion from the government, from the education system because of the government or because of how people perceive Indigenous people within their community. And then again, we give them a 0 if they are not protected at all. Next, we're moving on into into labor. So Indigenous people have the right to not be subject to any discriminatory conditions of labor, employment, or salary. So when we are looking at the scoring guideline, we give countries a 2 if they allow the Indigenous community to be a part of their economic system and their economy. So not forcing them into the informal economy, but also allowing them to be a part of the formal economy. And Zimbabwe did a really good job of doing this. Then we give countries a 1 if they're underrepresented in the workforce, and then we give countries a 0 if they are mistreated, get paid very low values, or just they're unable to work in that country. All right, this is our last category that we're going to be going over. This is health. So Indigenous people have the right to maintain their traditional health practices and the right to access without any discrimination all social and health services. All right, so I just want to point out Nambia in 2021. So when we were scoring this data, a lot of the data that we scored was from 2016 to 2021. So a lot of the times, so when we were scoring this, we saw the change of when COVID happened during 2020 and 2021. And a lot of times, Indigenous communities, the score and the rights went down dramatically, especially when it came to health. So it just shows when a global pandemic happened or when a global pandemic happens that the people in society that are deemed as less important, their rights are probably the first to go. But Nambia did a really good job at preventing this because they provided information in the mother tongue language on strategies for coping with the coronavirus, and they made sure that they were able to get vaccines, be quarantined, or if they needed any facilities. And then again, we give it a 1 if there's a lack of health facilities, and then we give it a 0 if there's limited access to health facilities or just any mandatory medication that they need they're not able to get. All right, so when you are scoring for this right, this right has a lot of different categories, and sometimes it can get very confusing and overwhelming. But something that you should know is that each of the categories are very closely linked to each other because this is a group right, so it's looking at this right more holistically. And one piece of information oftentimes can overlap between the categories. You kind of saw it in the presentation when we went over cultural rights, and one of the examples for 0, it showed that because they got their land taken away from them, they weren't able to practice their cultural practices. And this just shows that the different categories are linked to each other, and it's up to the discretion of the coder and when they reconcile if this information correctly fits in each of these categories. Again, going over land rights are the most violated right. And when you're coding for land rights, if there's anything that says forced relocation or forced anything, it's an automatic 0. And then something to consider is inconsistencies with the Indigenous World Report. So when we code for this, right, we use both the State Department's report and we also use the Indigenous World Report, and we kind of cross-compare them. But the Indigenous World Report, some years they report on this many countries, and then the next year, there'll be some countries that you coded in the year before, but just will not be in the report the next year. So there's inconsistencies, so this just calls on for people to do more reporting on this right. All right, moving forward, so the data isn't finished with reconciling the scores, and we still need to publish the newer data for Indigenous rights. So that's something that we C Rights has to work on. And then looking forward, I would like to see more information on the trends before and after COVID, kind of seeing how were Indigenous people treated before COVID happened, how were Indigenous people treated after COVID happened, and not only specifically in terms of health, but in other ways as well. And I also would like to see more research done into the rights of Indigenous women, because within the reports, a lot of times you saw that Indigenous women were facing a lot more discrimination or a lack of rights compared to Indigenous men. And I think it's something that we should consider. So it's coming soon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yulia. I'm a grad student here at URI, and I'm also a teacher assistant to Professor Mark. And today I will be talking about digital repression. There is a lot of information about what digital repression is. It is a somewhat new subject, and the information is a little bit messy. Digital technologies constantly develop, and what does it mean? That means that digital repression develops as well, and states finds a way to digitally repress their citizens. Pretty much digital repression is the way to surveil and manipulate individuals or certain groups with the use of digital tools, and it's also a way to raise a cost for someone to participate in any online activity. What do we see here? It's a poster that fell, but what do we see here? It's a meme, right? If you are a part of social media, most likely this is how you interact with your family, with your friends, with your coworkers. And you might ask yourself, okay, but what does a meme have to do with digital repression? Apparently it has to do a lot with it, but throughout this presentation I explain to you why. But first I want to go through types and actors of digital repression. There are two types of digital repression. It's physical control and information control. Physical control, it can be physical coercion with arrests of bloggers, with arrests of any online activists, and it can be channeling when there are laws that limit online speech, when there are certain community, like any platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, or whatever else it is, that have certain guidelines that every user has to follow. And then there's information control, which can also be information coercion and channeling. And we can witness it with internet shutdowns, with limited connectivity, with any internet restriction. And channeling can be any type of disinformation campaign, or for example, if there is something going on in a country, right, and a government or a state doesn't want you to pay attention to that, they kind of switch your focus by flooding online space with absolutely irrelevant information. Both types of digital repression can be overt and covert. The main actors of digital repressions, it's like three main actors. It's state agents with strong ties to political officials. It can be any federal agency, FBI, CIA, Department of Defense, whatever, any federal agency. Then a state agent with loose ties to political officials, any decentralized agency, for example, a local police. And the third type of the third actor is the most tricky one. It's a private actor. So it's any corporation, any business, or even an individual who can sell, who can produce any digital technology, such as spyware, malware, any kind of digital tool. And it's company or business firm, again, individual who can provide services to conduct digital repression. So why private actors the most tricky actors out over there? Because they are not regulated in a way there are no rules or like strong regulations, so they can sell their product to anybody. You can purchase it online if you want to. And the way they set up their structure, their companies, is so that it's very hard for any state to track them. It's very hard for a state to find out where they're actually located, and they always try to hide who their clients are and who they have in contracts with. It says over there that 74 governments contracted with commercial firms to obtain spyware or digital forensic technology. 44 out of these governments were autocracies and 30 of them were democracies. Here is one of the examples of what can happen if private actors sell their product to anybody. This journalist, Javier Cardenas, he was investigating drug cartels who were involved in obviously selling drugs and human trafficking. And his devices were like they had a spyware on it to purchase it from. And they tracked the journalist down and they shot him in the middle of the day in one of the Mexican cities. And that's probably just one of like 1,000 examples that what can happen if it gets into wrong hands, right? So the really bad news is that democracies and autocracies use the same digital repression tools. What does it mean? That means like whether you're in US, in Brazil, Canada, Australia, India, anywhere in the world, your country using the same, like all the states using the same digital repression tools that I just mentioned before. However, there is no data on how far or to which extent democracies are going in the use of these tools. We all assume that, yes, autocracies are definitely doing that, but since democracies are using these tools, we would like to know like how far they're ready to go. And on the data that I went through, it says that around 18% of the whole global population has unrestricted access to the internet. So it's only 18% of people in the world can go to internet where they don't have to get any like bans from the from the platforms. They can easily access any information. There is no search filtering and things like that, and that's a pretty low number. But the good news is that states have to be smart about it, and there are certain limits how and when they can use digital repression. So the reason for that is because it costs a country a lot of money if it completely shuts down internet, if it restricts internet. There is also research that says if there is a high surveillance in a country and a high censorship, there is going to be pretty much there's going to be a civil unrest. And in that case, the cost for people who are willing to protest, in most cases, like it doesn't matter to them. They are willing to be arrested. They are willing to be banned from online platforms if country is not careful with high surveillance and high censorship. However, if there is a low censorship and an individual feels that he can go online and search for any type of information, however, state still has a high surveillance, then it shows that citizens are content with the people who are in power. So, per se, they're happy that they have access to information. And there is a trend also that is happening. The states, they get involved into digital repression to prevent social protests, to prevent any kind of events from happening. For example, the British police, they were actually contacting certain online activists, and they were telling them, hey, we're watching you, make sure you behave. The case with San Francisco, when artificial intelligence kind of gets in the picture now, because it's it's something new. We don't really know yet how to regulate it, and they do allow like robots to use a lethal weapon if necessary. It is very well, there's no research on that, obviously, but we don't know yet to what else it can lead. The case with Philippines, for example, they do not use a lot of digital surveillance in their country, but right before elections, they had a lot of they banned a lot of platforms, they banned a lot of websites so that people don't get like a full picture of what's going on. They don't have a full access to the information. And they got involved into a lot of disinformation campaigns so that the party in power actually stayed in power. And this brings us back to our memes, right? Memes, they are responsible for helping fuel ongoing discourse on many issues. Why? Because if we look at it, okay, it's funny. It's, you know, it doesn't take your time to read news. You kind of can get, just looking at the meme for like 5 seconds, you already kind of understand, and okay, something is going on in the world. Like that definitely refers to something. And most of the people, unfortunately, base their decision, or like they conclude something just reading something like that. However, if we look at the first meme, Biden was not responsible for baby formula shortages. It was actually, it actually happened because of the COVID-19 and whatever else followed, right? And if we look at the famous Trump wall meme, couple of things wrong with it. First of all, it says enemies, which is already kind of makes you think that Mexico is an enemy, which it is not. It's just a neighboring country. Why not to, you know, perceive it as a friendly neighbor? And if we put Trump's rhetoric aside about the wall and look just at the facts, he did build less mileage than, per se, Barack Obama did. So it's just a fact. It doesn't mean you have to support certain candidate here, or, you know. So what can be done to minimize digital repression, minimize or prevent, because we have to be realistic. I don't think there's going to be a way like to stop it completely, right? And one of the first steps, like on the international level, there should be a very strict guidelines and laws that will regulate any actor, whether it's a state actor or a private actor, how they can use digital surveillance, to what extent they can use any kind of digital tools. And who knows, maybe in the future, we can all, you know, score digital freedom for C rights and see, like, you know, how the world is doing in this kind of field. Also, it's important to get an indication on what misinformation looks like, right? How to spot it, how to understand when the news are taken out of the context, because this is what happened in the world right now. We just read the heading and we assume things. And another one I want to point out here is I strongly encourage every one of you, and, you know, maybe you can pass it on to your friends and family, that critical thinking is an important aspect of analyzing any information that comes our way. And there is a lot nowadays. Like, it's hard to process it. So, you know, just be mindful. And again, like, as I mentioned before, there is no data to which extent democracies are using digital repression, and maybe that can be something that, you know, researchers, scholars will be interested in doing. There's no data in how many instances digital repression actually led to physical violence or, per se, arrests. How many bloggers were arrested because, you know, the government was spying on them. And there are, again, no rules and regulation who can purchase a spyware and to what extent it can be used. So that's something that we can just think about, and thank you very much.
right, thank you all very much. Fantastic presentations. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a short break. So please, there's a little bit more food left, I've heard, some coffee. We are going to do a student poster session. So the incredibly talented and hardworking students from 2 of Dr. Marks' classes, from Political Science 360, which is basically on the politics of human rights, and Political Science 580, which is a seminar in international relations theory, are going to present posters. This is an increasingly popular way of presenting research in social sciences, particularly political science, which is the social science that I know a little bit about. What you do is just walk around. There are 17 posters that are like mid-career professional political science caliber of research, so please ask them any questions that you have about the research. And yeah, you can ask pretty much any question about the posters that you want, how they went about doing things, where they want to take the projects, what they're doing with them, things like that. There's no question that's too difficult for these really talented people. So we're going to take about, 5 minutes, and then come on back, and there's no order to it. You can just go and visit posters. Thank you all very much.